Welcome to our session on federalism in Ethiopia, ethnicization, politicization, and diversity traditions. It is a pleasure to see that so many of you are joining us so early in the morning today. And first of all, a big thanks, of course, to the German-Ethiopian Association, and in particular to Alexander Bestle for organizing this event. My name is Sophia Wellek. I'm a graduate in War and Conflict Studies from the University of Potsdam and Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Today's panel is dedicated to the question revolving around the ethnic-based federalism introduced in the 1995 Constitution of Ethiopia. In contrast to many other federations where, for instance, geography is the organizing principle, we know that Ethiopia has opted for ethnicity as the basis for the organization of the state and draws the internal boundaries along ethnic lines. Now, what is salient, of course, is that this debate is very, very polarized. On the one hand, we have many that consider it a very relevant tool for the management of diverse societies, and they claim that it helps to reduce secession, conflict, and national disintegration. And on the other hand, however, there are also many critiques that claim that it would actually promote fragmentation, secession, and conflict, for instance, by freezing ethnic identity and by providing opportunities for ethnic entrepreneurs to press for their claims. And of course, there are so many factors that will be debated today throughout the session, and I'm very much looking forward to this. And the goal of this panel now, again, is to discuss the relationship between conflicts on the one hand in Ethiopia, and on the other hand, the ethnic-based federalism. So we will ask questions like, does federalism in Ethiopia actually promote conflict, or does it serve as a reliable tool of conflict management? And under what conditions and influencing factors? And first of all, to this end, we will first engage in a stock taking regarding Ethiopia's ethnicity.
Nein, alles gut.
Christian,
ist doch geil, ne?
Nein,
ich habe mich ganz unverbindlich in so eine, also auch nur als
Hallo, bitte,
Hallo,
bitte.
Please
so
mute.
Schalten Sie sich stumm.
Konferenz
Hallo, schalten Sie sich stumm.
Wie gesagt, Videos aus und
Herr Wiebe, bitte schalten Sie sich stumm.
So sorry for this interruption. So we have many more that haven't muted themselves yet. Please do so now so you don't disturb the conversation anymore. Thank you. Perfect. Let's go on. So just about the schedule today. First of all, we will rather focus on the stock taking regarding Ethiopia's ethnic-based federalism, focusing on the historical context and the conflict itself and relevant influencing factors. And only later then we will really focus on the future viability and talk about the remedies and fine-tunings of federalism that could serve the future viability of Ethiopian federalism. And now it's, of course, my pleasure to introduce you to our great panelists. First of all, I already told you Dr. Dereje already woke up very, very early in the morning because he's in Canada currently. Dr. Dereje Feyissa Dori is from Addis Ababa University and the Life and Peace Institute. And then on the other hand, we have Professor Wolbert Smidt from Mekelle University and the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. It's a pleasure to have you here. And unfortunately, I have to tell you that Professor Stefan Wolf today is eventually unable to attend, but instead I conducted an interview with him previously, and I will read some of the points that are very relevant for our discussion, and instead, so you will still learn about his most relevant points he's doing in his research. So just again about the schedule, we will now have our speakers first, Dr. Dereje and Professor Smidt. They will first, both of them, give an input, and you are very much invited to ask some questions afterwards on the input. And then, of course, we have our panel discussion, and please stay in line and be active. You're invited to be active afterwards as well, because there will be also a Q&A discussion in the end where you can also raise your hand and directly ask your questions to our panelists, or even if you feel more comfortable, just write in the chat your question, and Maya will be reading them and contributing to the Q&A. So I'm very looking forward. And please consider that all the session will be recorded. Maya, did you record it? Yes, I think. And so take this in mind. We hope that you are all agreeing to that. Okay, let's start first of all with Professor Wolbert Smidt's input. His input is on the regions of Ethiopia, socio-political realities within and beyond the state, and traditional practices of diversity, autonomy, and cooperation. And it will be interesting. His presentation will provide us an overview on Ethiopian diversity, its local, rural, cultural, geographic differences, as well as an historical background. Professor Smidt is an associate professor in ethnohistory at Mekelle University and researcher at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, and also assistant editor of Encyclopedia Ethiopica. And there are many more positions. If I list them, it will take probably 1 hour. It's really overwhelming what he all achieved. His main research focuses on traditional modern socio-political structure. That's also part of his presentation now. And yeah, welcome, Professor Smidt. I'm looking forward to your input, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me start with a very, very simple remark. In short, you have now been so kind to give the long version of my title, which is certainly too complex for a Zoom meeting. So let me simply say, I'm speaking about federalisms of the past. Federalisms in plural, because there's not one version of federalism, especially not in Ethiopia. There is many versions, and this is also true, of course, for the modern context, because there's many readings of what federalism means. And of course, we have to be clear that federalism is not a concept which is understood in the same way by everyone. So I will not put the political definition of federalism in the center of my talk, but simply observations of local socio-political realities, histories. Again, I'm sorry for the plural form, because there's not one history, but many different regions, histories, plus different readings of history, which is a problem, but which is also a very important factor for the understanding of the region. I have one request. I want to show a very simple PowerPoint presentation. Is it possible? Because I cannot share my screen. If not, I can send it by email, because I don't need it immediately in the beginning, but I would need it to show something a little bit later. Sophia, Wellek?
Maya, what do you think? Is it possible? Because I'm not the technical expert here.
Klaus, bist du da? Kannst du das öffnen? Oder wer ist da bei Admin?
Maybe Professor Smidt, maybe just go on and send it to my email address, and I will then organize it in the meanwhile.
Then it's okay. Very good. It's basically a map which will make it a little bit more clear what I'm saying. So it can also be a little bit later during the session. The main issues are rather to be explained. So the image material is not absolutely crucial for it, but it will be interesting for you. So I would be happy if we could share it a bit later. So I have started with my short remark on federalisms. there is one remark which I think is important about the role of history. Already in the session of yesterday, we have observed interesting tendencies. Some people mentioning, let's overcome history, let's look into the future, and let's not talk of the divisions of the past. This is one position which is very, very widespread. We know this, of course, from modern Ethiopian political discussions. We know it also from many other countries. The other position which we hear very regularly is this and that territory belonged to us in the past, or this and that atrocity was committed upon us in the past, or in the past Ethiopia was more stable than today, or in the past we could do this and this in Ethiopia and now we cannot, and similar. So we have two quite interesting positions. Both are dominant. The overall call for removing history from the debate, and the overall call of using history for political debate. Both is omnipresent. And you may see that this creates a contradiction about a common understanding what the role of history can be. And I observe a very simple factor in these discussions. It is the fact that history is used very much within today's historical debates. So, for example, there is a very basic pattern. If a specific territory belonged to elites or some socio-political structures in the past, those who consider themselves the ones who have inherited these structures, sorry for the abstract description, those who consider themselves to have inherited these ancient structures, maybe a territory, maybe a government structure or similar, they will say, because it belonged to us in the past, it has to belong to us now. This is a basic pattern of historical, of political interpretation of history. And that's the disease, if you allow me to use that word. The disease is that history is not used for understanding how societies organize themselves, how they create problems and solutions, which would be rather a useful look at history. But it is very often used as a sort of, let me call it, judicial or quasi-judicial argument. Because this and this territory belong to us, it has to belong to us now. Already one point, who is us? Us is sometimes someone who lived 1,000 years ago. Us is sometimes the grandfather of my lineage. Still, it's not myself. If I'm, for example, from an important lineage, us is the territory with which I identify. And so already here you see a problem of a construction of ownership through historical claims. This is one largely unconscious use of history, which has a very great potential of poisoning historical debates, because usually the view of history is focusing on claims. And claims, if they don't fit into the claims of the others, which is normally the case in a rapidly evolving modern structure with very different actors and very different groups. So if claims are against each other and strengthened by so-called objective historical arguments, then things become extremely dangerous. And we are exactly in this situation now. Almost every group which is active is sort of caught in this kind of historical rhetorics, more or less. So let me start with the screen. I think now it works. Let me try it. Do you already see it?
Yeah.
Very, very good.
Ja, aber mach das groß.
Aha, that's that's the question, how to do.
Rechts unten, da wo du siehst,
Ja.
die Leinwand.
Is it a little bit better now?
Ja, aber da unten,
Ja.
unten rechts hast du dies.
I had the similar problem before because I have a Mac, and what people tell me, what I find down there doesn't exist. So anyway, I
Ja,
think it's clear enough.
ich kann es bei dir sehen.
No,
Rechts unten, da bei den,
Okay.
wo der Viereck ist und da,
Hier?
genau,
This
da
one?
links. Nein, weiter links, weiter links,
Yeah,
weiter links.
this one?
Das.
Okay, thank you so much. Nothing happens? Oh no,
No.
it happens. Excellent, excellent. So let me continue. Thank you. That's a very big help. So let us first be clear. I'm not talking about history as a political instrument. I'm talking about history as an instrument to understand some of the dynamics of politics in societies developing over a long time. We are part of these dynamics. So history is not simply something of the past, it is something ongoing. That's also why the talks about removing our reference to history doesn't help in the debate, because we are caught by the history which is unfinished. We are in a historical process. We are caught by a historical process which is ongoing. And only if we look into where such dynamics started and based on which socio-political structures, we will know somehow in which kind of dynamics we find ourselves. So history is very often misunderstood as something of the past, which is not. It is misunderstood as a political instrument, which is extremely harmful, but it is quite useful if you want to understand some of the dynamics, not all, it also needs to be very clear, not all, but some of the dynamics in which we are caught. And some of the dynamics are not just 30 years, 40 years, or 100 years. Some of them go on over centuries. This is also linked with geographical realities, economic realities, realities on the ground, linked even with roads, routes, infrastructure, ethnic relations, inter-ethnic relations. There's quite many factors. I don't have the time to go into this detail, but I think it's clear, the main idea is clear. So now let me underline, I think I have 5 minutes left. I have to underline two major factors which are often misunderstood or not well known simply about the structure, the territorial structure of the rather recent past of Ethiopia. Today we know Ethiopia as a rather huge territory. You see here the borders of modern Ethiopia together with the borders of one of the historical Ethiopias. Again, something must be very clear. There is no border which is specifically the right Ethiopia. Borders have changed sometimes very slowly. Sometimes they are quite stable over generations, sometimes very quickly. So borders by nature have always a dynamic element. So a territory which belonged to one group at one point in the past would belong to another group at another point in the past. And here, 2 points. One, you see this sort of yellowish territory in the middle north, in the center and north, which is the state of Ethiopia as it existed around the 1860s, 70s, around the time of just late Todros, Atze Todros and Atze Johannes, in the beginning of almost up to the beginning, almost I say, of King of Kings, Menelik, or Emperor Menelik. The other territories which you see here, by the way, this is an absolutely imperfect map. We are working currently on making it a little bit better, but it's absolutely an impossible process because of very scattered sources. But to make it short, Ethiopia was not the only state in the region. There were a number of bigger and smaller and sometimes very small kingdoms with autonomous structures, and much more than autonomous, very often acting as independent states. Some of them with very close relations to Ethiopia through clan relations, but very often also under quite independent, which is especially true for Muslim territories and Muslim sultanates, which however undertook also a lot of diplomatic initiatives This is true, for example, for the kingdom, the Oromo kingdom of Jimma, which had diplomatic relations with Gojam, or Oromo kingdoms like Limmu, and other way around, but also with kingdoms in the Sudan or the Emirate of Harar. Sometimes these were relations based on war, but very often these were relations based on trade, and trade relations which were organized through sort of informal treaties. Informal, we would say, from a modern point of view, because we didn't have paperwork with bureaucracies involved, but we had witnesses, we had messengers. We find this in historical sources. So the first point which we have to see, that before the expansion, the late 19th century expansion of Ethiopia, we had a number of kingdoms, also non-hierarchical societies, which is typical for Borana, or partially for Arsi in Oromo, but also in other territories, non-Oromo, non-Cushitic territories, and others with very hierarchical kingdoms, who sometimes co-opted themselves into the expanding state and sometimes heavily resisted. One example of resistance is the kingdom of Kaffa, which was involved in a several years long war with very heavy casualties, with the king of Shoa, and later with the rulership of the Ethiopian state, which resulted in a final submission of the elites of Kaffa and an integration of the Kaffa state into the Ethiopian state. This very shortly. Now to come to the last point, I'm sorry, I speak, I think, already 1 minute too long, if I'm not wrong, but I still need 2 minutes, please forgive me. It's about the internal federal structures. I use federal, please be, I hope that you understand, not in a modern sense, but in a very, very loose sense, just to describe the phenomena of a lack of a very strong central rule over everything, over all territories. Sometimes there was strong central rule, but for many territories we can observe other structures. One example, we have a number of kingdoms within historical Ethiopia, such as the kingdom of Gojam, with a very strong border, which is the Nile River. Surrounding Gojam, Gojam had its own dynasty. Another example, which is Gojam is very well known. Shoa is also very well known with its own kings dynasties over generations, going on over generations, which had a strong relation with these, with the king of kings and the dynasties, and sometimes claiming access to the dynasty structures of the king of kings, but guarding a very high level of local socio-political autonomy with their own legal structures. Laws were not centralized, law were localized, and also lawmaking was localized, and taxation was local, and some taxation was always given to the central structures. And central is maybe a word which is already suggesting too much, because the king of kings was not responsible for many of the aspects which we today think belong to a state. Last point, very last point, as an example. There's many, many more examples, of course. It is Aksum. This is an example which is not well known, which we know from a local ethno-historical research. Aksum, which is interestingly missing in history books, was we would call it in European terminology a free city. A free city means a city with its own council of self-administration. So the Nubureid, who was the king, who was the governor of Aksum, appointed by the king, or by the king of kings, or by the emperor, was sort of the official structure above Aksum. Sometimes he was a cleric, sometimes it was a layman linked with the clerics. I leave the details aside, but highly interesting. There were elections, regular elections in the city of Aksum, electing a kantiba, electing a mayor. And interestingly, the Nubureid was accountable to the king of kings, while the Nubureid didn't have a local power to decide things. He had to consult on everything concerning the administration of the region, of the area, including the surrounding villages, with the elected, traditionally elected Kantiba. So we had a sort of city council, which we know from other cities worldwide. It's a quite interesting phenomena and overlooked in history. This has been abolished just by the Derg. Even Haile Selassie had respected these local autonomical structures, and we have many, many, many more examples. It would take 5 hours to talk about them, so I stop here. I just wanted to give you an impression of what we are talking about.
Thank you so much, Professor Smidt. This was a really relevant topic. You talked about the history of decentralization in Ethiopia. This is really important to keep in mind that decentralization is not new in Ethiopia. And also you pointed to the many differences in Ethiopia and also the role of history in shaping reality because of politics that are sometimes misusing it and how this changes perception. Thank you so much for this. That was really interesting. I told you already that unfortunately Professor Wolf cannot take part today because of Corona. Of course, this topic is always following us today. Instead, I would just suggest, because I really conducted a very interesting interview with him recently, and he made some very good points. So I will now read some of this very important points for our discussion later, and then we can keep it in mind and discuss this further as well. Just about Professor Wolf, he is Professor of International Security at the University of Birmingham and specialized in management of contemporary security challenges, especially in the prevention and settlement of ethnic conflicts and post-conflict state building in deeply divided societies. So he also published recently a very interesting World Bank report, and he's also addressing it in my interview. So my first question at that point was for him, what factors are particularly crucial for subnational governance to mitigate conflict? And it was interesting because he addressed various points that I will now read now. So these are not my own words, it's Professor Wolf's words. He said, first, subnational governance as an approach to conflict mitigation is not a panacea, of course. In other words, not all drivers of conflicts are responsive to a treatment with some form of subnational governance. So we have to be realistic about what kinds of conflict can be settled with subnational governance reforms. And second, because conflict mitigation techniques, here we found in the same study that the most effective combination of institutions is a form of subnational governance combined with various governance mechanisms like national PR, electoral system, and non-parliamentary form of government. So he addressed this mixed techniques in a way, and then and emphasized the combination of institutions that needs to be considered. And another question was also because federalism is a concept that is adopted all over the world. And what can Ethiopia actually learn from this broader comparisons? And he said that the first relates to the key institutions that work best in the mitigation of actual conflict. So the one lesson that he has already mentioned is that some form of territorial self-governance combined with a national PR electoral system and a non-parliamentary form of government has the greatest likelihood in reducing the risk of violent conflict. In turn, the worst combination of institution is one with no territorial self-governance arrangement, but with a proportional electoral system for the national legislature and a parliamentary form of government. The contrast between these two combinations is stark. In the former case, we find a likelihood of violent conflict of 2.5%. In the latter case, the risk is more than 5 times as great with 13.3%. And the other lesson learned, and then I quit, and I will also send you the link so you can read it if this was too quick for you. The other lesson he said is to be learned about the process of how a new system of institutions should be negotiated. And this is a relevant point. Findings of this World Bank study indicate that the issue about the inclusiveness of negotiations is relevant. This means that all relevant stakeholders are included in the settlement process. So nobody has to be ignored, and create together as resilient institutions and respond to citizens' needs. And this would then minimize the risk of future spoilers and derailing a peace process, especially if international partners commit to the long-term support of the governance structures. So all stakeholders have to be integrated. He also emphasized the role of democracy, many factors, and I will send the link in the chat so you can read it again. But it's some points that we wanted to address. So at least if he's not taking part today, you have an image of his, an idea of what he's doing currently. But now I would like to welcome Dr. Dereje again. I'm looking forward to your input. Dr. Dereje will rather look now on the Ethiopian case and identify the specific regional and political characteristics of the Ethiopian Federation, and also point to the distinct features within the wider family of multinational federation, the ideological background and achievements as well as challenges. So much looking forward. Dr. Dereje is adjunct associate professor at the Center for Federal Governance at Addis Ababa University. Also, he's research and policy advisor for the Life and Peace Institute, which is a peace-building organization in Ethiopia, and he released a variety of publications relevant for our discussion today on ethnic-based federalism. Most recently, for instance, as the co-editor of the book Ethiopia in the Wake of Political Reforms. Looking forward, Dr. Dereje, to your input, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and the organizers for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my ideas with you on such a relevant topic such as ethnic federalism, which is one of the hotly contested issues in contemporary Ethiopia. Regarding the question which the organizers have posed, whether ethnic federalism generates conflict or it's a peace-building tool, I think my point of departure here is this question should not be construed in binary terms. I rather prefer a critical appraisal of the system, which would allow us to simultaneously engage with both the achievements and challenges of ethnic federalism as a political order in the specific Ethiopian context. Let me say a few words about ethnic federalism and what is in the name. Ethnic federalism is a type of political order which relates to this idea of institutional recognition of ethnic diversity, both in terms of cultural rights, but also for political participation. It is different from territorial or geographic federalism, but rather similar to the cultural autonomy arrangement in a unitary states. In that sense, it reflects this global trend or a pluralistic turn in global politics with a greater sensibility and sensitivity to diversity. And this system has been put in place in Ethiopia since 1991 by EPRDF, or the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. Although we are post-EPRDF, we are still left with the system since 2018 as well. And basically, it's about the ethno-federal restructuring of the Ethiopian state, which has been very unitarian since the mid-19th century at least. Although the Ethiopian experience reflects a global trend, there are some specificities of the Ethiopian experience. One is this remarkable diversity that Wolbert just mentioned. There are more than 80 ethno-linguistic communities in Ethiopia, and some of them with a separate political history, different centers of state formation, and that makes it much more complex as compared with kind of like a more homogeneous ethnic federal states or multinational states in the West, whether it's in Canada or in Belgium. Rather, Ethiopia comes close to India and Nigeria in terms of sheer diversity or complexity. And that makes it very specific to the Ethiopian case. But more importantly, ethnicity is used even by ethnic federal standards, by multinational federal standards. Ethiopia is going to be too far in using ethnicity as a hegemonic frame of reference to organize politics. Ethiopian regional states, as we call them, Killils, are not the cantons of Switzerland or the provinces of Canada. In our case, ethnicity is used as a building block of the federation. I wanted to show you the map, which I'm not able to do that. In any case, if you see the federal map of Ethiopia, you see they are ethnically carved out, although they don't really neatly reflect all the ethnic dynamics, but there are predominantly ethnic homelands, so to speak, and that makes it really very different even by international standard in reference to other similar political arrangements. Now the question is the genesis of this model. Where is it coming from and where is it heading to? Here, I think we have to bring in two important contexts. One is the historical context, the other one is the ideological context. The historical context in the Ethiopian sense is the nation-state building project and its discontents. Despite diversity, Ethiopia is one of the few countries, I think, outside of Europe where the idea of the nation-state was tried and it utterly failed. Although it has brought a certain degree of political and social assimilation, it kind of like it was imposed on diverse societies and diverse histories, and with a core culture in the historic Abyssinia, in the central and the northern part of the country, predominantly the Amharas, the Tigrayans and the Agaws. They were kind of like, they were like a cultural nation somehow, so to speak. But Ethiopia of today is no Abyssinia. It's much bigger, much complex and diverse than it was. And the idea of forging a nation state out of this high, remarkable diversity brought its own discontent, and ethno-liberation movements proliferated contesting that as well. So we need to take into account this very indigenous process of state formation, how Ethiopian emperors and kings tried to forge a nation through cultural homogenization and political centralization, which failed. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is that in the current discourse, many people think that ethnic federalism is entirely a construct by TPLF or EPRDF. We need this historical context. With or without EPRDF or TPLF, the ethnic factor in Ethiopian politics has been very salient. It doesn't have to be necessarily dealt with ethnic federalism, but it has always been with us. And of course, TPLF had a specific ideological spin on that, which I will come back now. And the ideological context to that is the Marxist framing of the nationality question. You don't understand the Ethiopian model or experience in ethnic federalism without a reference to this ideological context. The nationality, why this idea of self-determination, why it sounded so radical, the very terms that we are using, nations and nationalities, this is very Marxist, very Leninist, very even Stalinist. In that sense, this frame, this Marxist frame brought a very specific model of ethnic federalism in the Ethiopian and in the Ethiopian context. In terms of assessment, this system has its own strength and weakness with reference to the Ethiopian complexity. One is it has partly at least redressed the historical grievances of ethnic minorities. As I briefly mentioned, there is this nation building project and its discontents in Ethiopian center-periphery relations. So there is a certain degree of reconfiguration of the Ethiopian state on a more inclusive basis. In that sense, really the model has delivered, and Ethiopia really needed its own pluralistic turn with institutional recognition of that diversity. And now we also have seen this regaining of self-esteem and dignity among Ethiopia's diverse communities, and with the creation of a regional political space, language rights, and all this had its own positive impact, which is also very important for national cohesion as well. And up until recently also, it brought a relative political stability as well, because there, I mean, by late 1980s, we had more than 15 ethno-liberation fronts. Secessionism was very, very strong. And in that sense, this model somehow delivered a certain degree of cultural right and also a new space for political participation. And that was very, very important, kind of as part of the process of state reformation in Ethiopia, so to speak. But like any other system, it is also fraught with dangers and also limitations. One is also the ideological basis or underpinning of the model itself. In short, this is a socialist idea put in place in a post-socialist setting. EPRDF assumed power in 1991. You could be anything but socialist in 1991, as in the 60s and 70s and 80s. One would be very, very eccentric not to be socialist, kind of, but to be socialist or to work with socialist idea in 1991 is something like out of place, so to speak. So even EPRDF itself was struggling with its own idea. Its own political socialization is within Marxist strand, and it wanted to hold on to it, but it also realized things rapidly changed. So there's a lot of ideological entanglement somehow. It wanted to mix kind of like ethnic federalism with its own liberal touch or multinational federations of the West, but it never really successfully managed to bring in this necessary adjustment. But apart from these ideological challenges and the rapidly changing context, is some practical issues or questions as well. One is the limits of territorialization of ethnicity in the Ethiopian context, given the settlement pattern. I just mentioned that there are ethnic homelands now, whether it's Oromia, Amara, Tigray, Afar. It gives you the impression that these are homogeneous ethnic homelands, which they are not. There are millions of people who live outside of their so-called ethnic homelands. We are talking about millions of people, just to mention the millions of Amharas living in the Oromia region, for instance. These are practically outsiders, and this is very exclusionary political process, so to speak, which is very much related to the conflict situation. And also what to do with the millions of Ethiopians with mixed ethnic heritage. They just don't fit into this ethnic mold, and the imposition that, to say that ethnic identity is the prime signifier of one's identity is something which has been contested. For some Ethiopians, religious identity is much more important than ethnic identity, or they have multiple identity that they want to combine. So this has brought its own complications as well. Equally important for peace and a conflict in the Ethiopian context is the politics of difference, which is not really well tempered with the politics of commonality, so to speak. So the emphasis has been, redressing past injustices, wrongs, but then the emphasis kind of like on this kind of difference went a bit too far, and you can't just really build a nation or a state with a politics of difference. You needed something more than that as well. And the territorialization of ethnicity has hardened ethnic boundaries, and this has very much undermined national cohesion. Maybe important for current, for contemporary debate in Ethiopia is, there is this kind of a certain degree of this anti-Amhara political sentiment that underpins the federal edifice. We're talking about national oppression. There must be an oppressor, and that oppressor is almost named, and these are the Amharas. These are the second largest group in Ethiopia. What to do with that? With an emphasis on Amhara domination as empire builders, gave the impression of a perpetrator and a victim, as if everyone else was just, the good guys in town, the Amharas are the bad guys, which is not the case. If you have a longer historical point of view, there have been processes of state formation that Wolbert mentioned, and there is violence in state formation. We don't have to condone it, but we shouldn't single out one process and privilege it, and then create this kind of like demonic and angelic actors. This dichotomization is not really helping us a lot. For instance, Wolbert mentioned the process of state formation among the Oromos in the kingdom of Jimma itself. And the way the Jimma state was built was also through violence. There was slave trade, there was conquest, there was territorial expansion. And if you ask Jimma's neighbors, I don't think they have a very benign idea and image of that kingdom as well. Although nationalists paint this kind of like, we are the good guys and they are the bad guys kind of it. So, and this is now, currently as we speak, there's a kind of very militant Amhara ethnicity emerging, violently also contesting that, we are not alone. We are all in it, kind of it. And let's have a new beginning, and let's have a kind of, if you talk about these things, when does history start? You guys are telling us that Amharas were the conquerors and the bad guys in the 19th century, and they're invoking a broader historical reference. Now, the debate is going back to the 15th and 16th centuries of Oromo expansion, Oromo, however you call it. There was also a certain degree of violence. So we need that kind of a broader historical approach and the bigger picture, instead of just simply singling out and privileging one historical moment and put all the blames on that. So this is really, as we speak, some of the the hottest political issues in Ethiopia, and Amharas are getting organized, and then they're pushing back, and these are adding a new layer of complication as well. Another one important point that I really would like to mention as a way of challenge is the democratic deficits of our own federal system. You can't have federalism without a democratic dispensation, so to speak, both vertically, state-society relations. EPRDF is proved to be a kind of fundamentally an illiberal regime, and this very authoritarian. So there was a certain degree of re-centralization, which was not well taken by the regional states. But also, horizontally, we have experienced that democratic deficit. And also this very illiberal values, the issue of protection of minorities at the subnational level. Millions of people living in these ethnic homelands, they feel vulnerable. There are times when, their insecurity borders even ethnic cleansing and eviction, and they're de facto considered as second-class citizens. So what does it mean to have this model without really having a robust liberal value? And on a comparative note, Ethiopia's federalism might be equated with the multinational federation of the West, but both are being implemented under very different value contexts, so to speak. And multinational federalism without liberal values is just a riskier proposition. Let me now quickly say a word or two on the trajectory of the model itself, ethnic federalism. EPRDF itself reflected on the limits of its model. And since 2006, after the contested election, it was kind of like it started toning down ethnicity as a structuring principle of politics somehow. And the idea is, to kind of like through a fast-tracked and state-led development, they wanted to transcend ethnic boundaries by creating a national economy, industrialization, and it was hoped that this would foster cross-cutting ties. But I think this came too late and too little, so to speak. And even in so doing, they are being true to their Marxist background, because when Stalin or Marx or Lenin raised the issue of the nationality question, they had that internationalist outlook. And of course, if you are a Marxist, it is the economy is stupid. So, if you have a national economy and it's possible to transcend all this kind of like subnational identities kind of it. So EPRDF was going in that direction, but because of its own politics of difference, it became too challenging for them to clean the mess somehow, which was created by the system. So outlook, where are we now and where are we heading to? There is now, as I said, hot debate on the institutional design of the Ethiopian Federation. Some are arguing, it appears there is kind of an emerging federal consensus in Ethiopia, but the specific institutional design or arrangement of it is being hotly debated. So we have those who are arguing in favor of the status quo, ethnic federalism, and those who are pushing for territorial or geographic federalism. But unfortunately, this discursive struggle or battle has its own violent manifestations. We have seen the proliferation of communal violence in Ethiopia for the last 3 years. And interestingly, both camps are referring to this violence to justify their respective political projects. The ethno-federalists are saying that, you know, the territorial or geographic federalists, they don't even call them federalists, they call them Hadawi, which means Unitarians or centrists. They say they are deliberately stoking communal violence to discredit ethnic violence, say ethnic federalism. They say, look, this system is inherently problematic. It is generating conflict. And the territorial federalists or the Unitarians or the centrists are also referring to this violence like what the other camp is saying. And look, this is the mess we are left with, ethnic federalism. Unless, you know, we go through a constitutional review and amendment, we are set for even a bigger problem, more conflict to come in the future. And this issue is being contested and debated. It will be even more in the run up to the June 2021 election. I don't know whether if you give me one time, I might share with you my view of the system. Otherwise, it might come in the Q&A session.
We will definitely talk about that later again. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Dereje. You touched upon all the necessary points we are going to discuss today. So what I took away definitely is that ethnic-based federalism is not a construct by the TPLF, but rather resulted from a long historical process through political centralization, assimilation, and of course, the ideological context. You addressed challenges and advantages of the federal system in Ethiopia, and also gave an outlook about the debate. Thank you so much. Let's go to the panel discussion now. I hope Professor Smidt is here as well. I don't see him anymore. Are you still here?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. I really liked, let's stick to the historical context in the beginning now again, and later really focus on the future. When it comes, lessons learned from your inputs is now, for me at least, that decentralization has deep roots in Ethiopian history, and also ethno-federal system was in a way a result of the centralization process. What does this actually mean now for Ethiopian unity? Was it more effective during which periods? During periods of centralization or decentralization, that Ethiopia was actually united? What can we learn from history? What's your take on this point?
So shall I start with that?
Yes, you can start, Professor Smidt.
Thank you. So that was a very, very helpful presentation by Dr. Dereje. I'm really happy about it. Especially he underlined one aspect which I did not mention, but which has to be understood as part of the historical process. State formation has a lot of violent aspects. So I'm really happy about this aspect, because we should not have an ideal or idealistic idea about what state means. However, I would say that there's different levels of violence, different levels of let's say, also violent thinking within political structures. I would say that yes, there are differences, and especially when we see that these state formation processes are based on networking, especially on merchant networking, and the entertainment of agreements with neighbors, including neighboring entities, we see a less violent element in it. And there's another element, which is, I think, very interesting. It's what we call in anthropology interethnic clan relations, which sounds very ethnographical, but it's also extremely political. If we look into the structures, the political structures of states, especially in the South, former states of the South, in a number of cases, we see that the hierarchical structures of these states, by the way, who is the one with the sound? Maybe someone can
unmute yourself.
I think it's disturbing everyone, so let me pause shortly. Hello? Now I continue.
Yeah.
I don't know what this is. Okay, so to come to the point, we have a tendency of understanding ethnicity just as ethnic groups. We have a sort of cultural folkloristic look at these groups, which is misleading because all of them are ethno-political structures, or let me be very clear, without the ethnic element, socio-political structures, which are often forming themselves within a sort of ethnic setting, which should not mislead us to understand them simply as ethnic groups. No, no, they are social political groups. And these social political groups, and now I have to stop because there's too many details, I generalize it. We see social political groups which are very much based on military expansions, even yearly military expeditions, regularly even ritualized clashes, and others which are very much based on other kinds of interaction. We do see these differences between these social political entities, including sort of republican structures in some cases. So yes, violence is there. Violent state building is there, but we see that this is not dominating everything, also not dominating the entire state building process. And now to come to the conclusion regarding your question, we can observe that we had very often sort of Unitarian discourses while having very decentralized practices. So we cannot, absolutely not, say that there was one historical process which was not violent. Every historical process in the entire region had violent aspects, but we are able to identify again and again periods where there was a sort of, let me call it, precarious balance between local autonomies, rules of systems of self-rule, including republican structures, treaty discussions between a center or neighboring states, and a sort of not very belligerent central structure. In some cases, however, we see that the centers are highly engaged in military campaigns. And we can observe that there is a lot of periods in Ethiopian history where the greater states, which includes the Christian Ethiopian state, but it includes also the empire of Adal, the Muslim empire of Adal in the 16th century, sometimes switch into expansion mode. And these periods of expansion, they seem to be sort of repetitive, appearing again and again as a sort of unfinished business. And this unfinished business is highly linked with state violence. It's not complete, but this is to give you an idea that none of the structures are non-violent, but that with the centralized idea, which is an unfinished idea, unfinished project, we have again and again an appearance of highly violent histories of expansion of different kinds, not only of the Christian state, but also of other states who did have this tendency. Dr. Dereje has also mentioned examples. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is interesting. This means that throughout the history of Ethiopia, there was always very high conflict intensity. So it's not only this period of having this new 1995 constitution with ethnic-based federalism that Ethiopia turned very violent, but this is part of the history. And maybe also, Dr. Dereje, can you add something to this as well? What can we learn from this historical context for Ethiopian unity? What can we learn from it?
One thing that I would like to highlight here is kind of Ethiopians' enchantment with big ideas or meta ideas or ideologies. When we do things, we would like to do them big somehow. Yeah, there's always this big push, whether it's centralization or now decentralization or ethnic federalism. It's just like a pendulum. We go from one extreme to the other. We still need to, develop a sense of balance somehow without, this kind of like also binaries or kind of like dichotomies. And I mentioned, for instance, with ethnic federalism, even by international standards, I think we have gone too far somehow, yeah. And I was really curious. For instance, this idea come from a previously core part of Ethiopia, which is Tigray somehow, although they were overtaken by the Amharas or others in due course of time. Tigrayans were one of the major architects of the idea of Ethiopia or the Ethiopian state, and I was kind of like intrigued that the idea of Ethiopia is deconstructed from within, from its core areas, and for me it's always a puzzle. It's not from Gambela or Benishangul that this radical proposal is coming from. Okay, then I mentioned the ideological angle dimension to it, but there is also some sort of like we need to kind of get into what kind of ideas got into our leaders' mind and then why they do what they are doing. And one of my PhD students, for instance, was a former Melles's secretary when Melles was the head of the cadres, and he told me something which I found very interesting. When I asked him this question, why is Melles pushing this idea of politics of difference? Really, does he really mean it? And after all, you guys have been part of the core. And he said, there is something that Melles used to say, and this is the necessary bending. By that he meant, because this idea of centralization went too far since the mid-19th century, more so during Haile Selassie, and then somehow further elaborated by Mengistu. So there is this feeling that they need to come up with a radical idea to restructure the whole things. But at some point, they hope that they will have their own sense of balance. So it's kind of like when Melles said, what is Ethiopian flag except it's a piece of cloth? If you really pay attention to his rhetoric, it is incredibly radical. And many people believe because, he is half Eritrean and half Ethiopian, he doesn't relate to the idea of Ethiopia. I mean, we all believe that, and we question his national credentials, so to speak. But I got that insight, from people who closely worked with him. Sometimes he was doing that deliberately, hoping that somehow we will come to the center by, pushing or pulling it to another extreme. But unfortunately, we remain there. When he tried to make some adjustment, it was just too late. And the idea had a life of its own. And then it became so difficult to kind of like to have that kind of balance. I think there is something very, I don't want to kind of buy into Ethiopian exceptionalism. Sometimes we cannot really avoid to deal with the specificities. And one of this Ethiopian exceptionalism is enchantment with big ideas and, like this, our pendulum way of thinking or mindset somehow from one extreme to the other, and not being able to, kind of like, think in terms of gray areas, common grounds, and maybe making combinations. But either or kind of it is something which is really, really killing us. And, haven't we learned that even in our mythologies, we are not lazy in our claims. And look, many people claim, for instance, Queen of Sheba from Yemen to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, wherever, but Ethiopians are very serious about that. This is a myth which made history. And, if you kind of like unpack that claim, it is a kinship with Christ, isn't it? This divine kingship, many other societies have it, but it has to be so big somehow. And now, interestingly, Ethiopian Muslims are coming up with the myth, but they wouldn't call it a myth, but maybe it has some historical foundation. Ethiopia has become a land of the first hijrah. And now, as we speak, Protestants are coming up with a very interesting, also reactive myth that Ethiopia protested earlier than Germany, that Reformation started in Ethiopia well before Martin Luther had his own revelation or whatever. So it's kind of like, it's fascinating, but sometimes it's an overkill somehow. And it's kind of going for, big idea, the big push, if you succeed, you succeed big. Of course, the risk is when you fail, you fail big time. So this is how I see it. Both, Theodoros' idea of centralization is kind of like, it's very un-Ethiopian, so to speak, because decentralization was kind of part of the Ethiopian situation for partly out of necessity or by default, or because of the salience of regional identities or reflecting the diversity. And then he had this idea of building a very strong nation and should be so strong that, it has to be made kind of like, also fast-tracked. Yeah, that's why I was so disappointed when the British did not respond to his, appeal. Help me build Ethiopia as soon as possible. Send me this. Then, they didn't respond, and the rest is history. And then, of course, Johannes, his idea of controlled regionalism, as Professor Baharu calls it, it's more kind of, it reflects local reality than, he was federalist, but also kind of centrist, allowing enough space for regions within this overarching Ethiopian national identity. And he has also made some experiment, but these were kind of like, these are, episodes somehow. But the in the long term, what is very dominant motif in Ethiopian political history, I call it this enchantment with big ideas, or the big push is really kind of like an overkill.
Thank you so much. So we realize really that decentralization is a truly Ethiopian concept. But now, after this historical background, let's look to the present. What we do see is now that we are currently experiencing a heavy war in Ethiopia, and there are many empirical studies. For example, the ACLED report claims that we can indeed actually see an upsurge of ethnic conflicts since the introduction of the ethno-federal system. Now, when we talk about decentralization and federalism, do you now think that federalism is still like the best concept to respond to such conflicts, or is there any alternative? Maybe a question to both of you. You can decide who wants to start, Professor Smidt or Dr. Dereje.
I'm happy if Dr. Dereje starts, but I would also have a comment.
Yeah, I'm very much aware that, federalism or ethnic federalism or multinational federalism, by the way, there is a politics of the term. We don't call Canada ethnic federal. Yeah? We don't call Belgium ethnic federal, but we use the term multinational somehow. So there is a lot of politics of the term itself. For me, they kind of, although there are some variations, they belong to the same kind of like federal families, if you will. I'm aware of the limits of these federal solutions to ethnic conflict, and especially the way it has been implemented in the Ethiopian context by EPRDF. But I think sometimes we have to be a bit careful not to throw the baby with the bathwater somehow. What has it really achieved? What has it really delivered? And it's kind of like maybe a pragmatic and realist approach than just simply a normative debate. I think the way I see it, that ethnic federalism for me is a non-ideal but realist approach in Ethiopia, at least in the short term. We cannot wish it away. And many people make this essential mistake that if you get rid of TPLF, you can scrap the constitution and say goodbye to ethnic federalism and then anything but ethnic federalism. It has a much broader constituency than just simply a focus on TPLF or giving political authorship of the system to TPLF. As I said, TPLF had its own ideological spin, the Marxist frame, and the fact that it came from, there are so many kind of like issues which we can make connection with, but the issue goes further than that. And look now, who is championing the idea of ethnic federalism in Ethiopia? Oromo nationalists are pressing that, and they are saying over our dead bodies. If you tamper with that, you would even lose more of what has remained of Ethiopia, kind of it. And it's not only the Oromo nationalists, ethnic federalism has also its own constituency in the peripheral part of the country. They were, as David Turton said, their problem with ethnic federalism was not because it was too ethnic, but because it was less federal. So it's kind of there has been different types of resistance and oppositions against the model. You can be as much as Unitarian or centrist and have a problem with the system. You can even be ethno-nationalist and you can still have a problem. And the convergence of these two forms of discontents created that explosion in 2018 or during the protest movement. But that was more of a shared grievance than a shared vision. So there are many people who think that there's nothing wrong with having ethnic federalism. We love it. We want to make it even bigger, and some even want to make it even more confederal than it is already. So in that sense, we cannot really wish it away. It will be with us for some time to come. The best would be, or what is desirable and even feasible for me, is to improve the existing structures in some specific areas, such as protection of ethnic minority rights at the subnational level in the regional states, but also a greater political investment at the national level as well. We need to complement our politics of difference with a politics of communality. If we want, there are so many things that we share in common. It's all kind of like, what do we really remember? Remembering is as much about forgetting, isn't it? And there are some things which have been actively silenced in order to promote a certain political project. If you start with the politics of difference, surely there are so many things that we don't share in common, or this is a deeply divided society. But as Wolbert rightly mentioned, we are not all about difference. There has been a lot of interactions, a lot of socio-cultural exchanges across ethnic boundaries. And these boundaries have never been as stark or as rigid as they are now. So there has always been certain degree of permeability, which allows different kind of social and cultural and economic exchange. We can also remember that if you want to, it's possible to bring in or to create a space for a politics of communality as well. So it's kind of like, if we really, in the short term, if we put in place a mechanism for protection of minorities in the regional states and a greater political investment in national cohesion. And I think maybe in the long term, it might be possible to transcend this and then come up with a different political arrangement. By the way, as I briefly mentioned, even EPRDF itself thought about that because of its Marxist background. They say the end game is not really ethnic federalism. At some point, if we succeed in creating a national economy, people would reach a level where ethnic identity is no longer compelling somehow. It just become ornamental, not really a political imperative, but something that they just remember it during their cultural festivity or their ethnic costumes or things of that nature. So they had even this kind of like more, they consider partly ethnicity as a transient phenomena, but on the other hand, they also solidified it in the constitution, which makes it so difficult to go through amendment. But even they thought that that's not the end game. It's kind of like, it it's kind of like a historical contingency. Somehow we had to go through that because of our history kind of stuff. And then they added another layer to that. It's the nationality question of Marxism. And that made things a bit more complex. Otherwise, even they thought it's possible somehow to transcend ethnicity by creating a national economy, fostering cross-cutting ties. And that's the whole idea of the developmental state, by the way. And it has to be fast-tracked because they are aware of the limits of ethnicity and how this might undermine their idea of building a common political community, because you can't really build a nation or a state only through a politics of difference, which has been the case in Ethiopia for the last three decades. So this is how I see it. And the message that I would like to tell to my Ethiopian compatriot is, it's one thing to wish, but we cannot wish away our problems, our challenges. It has had a life of its own. It has a much broader constituency. Isn't it the time that even there are some other groups in Ethiopia which are still excited by the idea of ethnicity? They are still pressing for recognition. And we have seen how much intense the Sidamas were for recognition. And there are, dozens of nationalities or ethnic groups in southern Ethiopia who are pressing for recognition. For them, recognition is a public good. They really want that, partly they want their identity to be recognized, but also because of the distributive state, they want to have a greater pie from a greater access to the federal pie, so to speak. So this is the situation that we have. We have to work on that and improve it, and kind of through negotiation and maybe a bit of hybrid models than A or B.
Thank you, Dr. Dereje. So decentralization, but improving the existing structures for sure. Professor Smidt, do you have something to add?
Yeah, but very shortly.
Yeah.
This was just a perfect answer, going into many details and very, very thought-provoking and very necessary remarks. So thank you for this. Maybe I'm just warning from the question. The question itself contains some sort of danger of misunderstanding or may mislead us. The question is somehow, does federalism lead us to violence? Is federalism a solution? If I may say so, this is a wrong question. I explain. I don't criticize the one who is asking. But I want to show an element which is very often repeatedly misleading us. The question is not simply that we choose this model or that model. The question is first, what are the realities on the ground? And this is political imaginations, this is social political structures, this is economic realities, this is even very modern movements of youth unrest, the feeling of political dissatisfaction, linguistic boundaries. The list is very, very long. So we do not start with the question, which model is right? We start with the question, what are the realities on the ground? And that's exactly the purpose of my small contribution, focusing on some historical realities, just mentioning very few, to show how complex the situation is on the ground. And I totally agree with all the remarks of Dr. Dereje, who said the question, this is not something which we can wish and wish away, or just we push a button and suddenly we have another Ethiopia. No, we will not have. Whatever we say, we can only respond to these very complex realities, including conflictual realities, and look for models to respond to them. So by default, there are federalist structures on the ground. If we recognize them or not is the question, and how do we recognize them? So there is a lot of talking about the sudden appearance of ethnicity in 1991. This is so important that I have to mention it and underline this kind of concept, because in a way it is very surprising that this concept, this idea, or this perception of things even exists, because of course it didn't appear. Of course it didn't pop up suddenly in 1991. Of course the ethnic groups were not invented. If we look just a little bit into anthropological and historical sources, all of them are there. All of them are interacting and were interacting with the state in different ways, with state actors, with their own elites. There's a lot of history of interaction. So, of course, this didn't appear, but the fact that people in some centers didn't see them is highly significant, and highly significant in the sense that it means many of the elites were blinded through their own visions of the state without knowing their state. I'm sorry, it sounds radical, but that's, I think, a core problem. And this is a core problem repeated by elites in different ways. When people believed that creating some sort of ethnicized federation would solve everything, is again a process of blinding. This idea of having one model solving everything. Dr. Dereje just described it perfectly. I will not repeat it. I was very happy about this, his remark on these grand ideas which solve everything. No, what we have to do is much more integration of the very diverse realities on the ground, which include pastoralist groups, which include very different religious groups, very different geo-ecological spheres. All these are very, very significant realities, and by fact, it forces any state into some sort of federalism, and certainly not simply a geographic federalism, which is imposed by some central state structures. But there must be a process of self-determination, and that's precisely what is originally meant by the term self-determination, which is in the Constitution. It is misunderstood, including by local elite, radicalized elites, that self-determination always means being by yourself, leaving the state. No, finding your place in the state, or in very exceptional cases outside the state. Yes, this can be included in self-determination, but self-determination means that social political groups are finding a way to interact with the other social political groups in the region, and this process is not over. Last point, we very often believe that the last 30 years something were marked by federalism, that the last 30 years were in fact a federalist state. Yes, it was attempted. But if we look at political structures, which were often autocratic, sometimes reformist, we have to be clear that even the last 30 years are not sort of one block of political action, but it was going in waves, democratic reforms, economic reforms, political reforms, sometimes with a decrease of autocratic structures, sometimes an increase. It was quite heterogeneous. Even regionally, it was very heterogeneous. Some regions were part of structures of oppression. Other regions were developing in a quite different way. So in short, the federation of the last 30 years were an unfinished federation with strong autocratic structures, which sometimes acted in a centralist way, which these leaders were supposed to reform. And then, for whatever reasons, these centralist structures were then kept to some degree. So we are in a process of an unfinished federation, an unfinished response to local federal realities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we discussed already the historical context. Now we talked about the concept of ethnic-based federalism itself, and you both emphasized we need reforms and we need to improve the current structures. Now my last question, and then I leave the debate to our Q&A, but let's now really focus on the future. What needs to be done? What are the next steps? And when it comes to political settlement, to the reforms by Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed, would be great if you now focus on the future, and then I hand over to Maya for the Q&A.
May I come in now?
Dr. Dereje, you can
Yeah.
start. And also maybe go back to your debate during your presentation. We are all excited to hear your view on the debate on federalism.
One thing which is very complicating the current debate on the future of federalism in Ethiopia is the lack of an honest debate. There is a lot of misrepresentation, a lot of kind of like mischaracterization of both groups. For instance, those who are presenting themselves as federalists, they would call the other camp Ahadawi. In Amharic, it means centrists. Despite the fact that, I mean, there are still really some, but this, I would call them fringe elements who would openly articulate a centrist position in terms of like to rebuild Ethiopia as an empire, or to rebuild Ethiopia as kind of a very, formally centralized political structure. There are very few of them, but there appears to be an emerging federal consensus, but the real debate is on the particular institutional design of the federation. So to put all those who are against ethnic federalism as Ahadawi is, I think, this is reduction of complexity, which is done deliberately. And those who are championing the idea of territorial federalism or geographic federalism, they demonize those who are in favor of ethnic federalism, as if it's happening only in Ethiopia. Yes, the words that they use, Yezer politica, I mean, it's kind of like, it's in Amharic, it's stronger. The way the term they use to describe ethnicity is like politics of the blood, and which is very demeaning, very kind of like, subhuman, or, there's a lot of labeling somehow, which is, affecting the quality of the debate. Somehow we need to start there, a kind of an honest conversation, national conversation, to weigh our various options. But both are somehow representing the other in such a negative image that sometimes you find it so difficult to participate in such a debate, because again, you kind of like, you would be put in either A or B. Sometimes, there are many people who would like to see the middle ground, and then maybe out of the box, out of these two maybe extremes, but, there might be other constellations can be tried out. But it's kind of the framing of the debate is part of the problem. And they are not being sincere to each other, and they exaggerate the limitations of the other. In a debate, you can say this is okay, but this is a kind of debate with existential consequence. We are not talking about just public policy debate of a benign nature, whether to have a dam here or not, or I don't know what. But this is about the survival of the nation, the survival of us as people, and the cost of disintegration and things of that nature. So it's kind of, the stakes are so high that we need really an honest national conversation on our contentious issues, which is missing. A further complicating factor here is the new administration's position on this in this debate. I would rather say Abiy has deliberately chose to be ambiguous, because ambiguity could be a political resource. We have seen and we have learned, that Abiy has been very, very populist through and through for understandable reason. He wanted to appeal to a broader section of society. So he would go to Bahar Dar, and then he would have an Amhara speak. He would go to Bali or Jimma, and he would have an Oromo speak. It was necessary to bring short-term stability, some sort of, that we pretend as if we all agree, which is not the case. But this is something which you might do for 6 months and a year and a half. But, the longer dragged it is, the more contentious it becomes, and people come up with all kinds of conspiracy theories, and they want really to have a sense of direction or kind of a roadmap, which he has been asked for the last 3 years. So it's kind of, I understand why he's ambiguous, but at heart, I would rather say he is more on he calls it politics of national unity, by also upholding the existing structure, but improving it through a constitutional review process, and expect, days after the election, and all indications show that Prosperity Party will be elected by hook or crook anyway, and we will be going through a constitutional review process. And sometimes I found him pragmatic and a realist. He said, he also reflects what I said, we need a more realistic approach. We cannot wish away our problems. So ethnic federalism will be with us, kind of it. Sometimes he signaled that, although in another occasion, he might say completely different things. And sometimes, in order to earn popularity across different boundaries, he goes extreme. And, an average Oromo intellectual or educated Oromo, or if Oromo nationalist would say, Abiy is nothing but an incarnation of the Amhara Empire, kind of it. Like, why is he investing so much in waxing Menelik somehow? He's summoning the dead, is it not enough we are fighting Menelik of the 19th century? He wants to bring him alive, kind of it. And they are so much provoked and they are angry. They really think that he is Amhara through and through. And why he's doing it? Maybe he believes in it, or maybe because of his political socialization. Don't forget that his background is in the army. This is an important institution where nationalism, national identity is often very strong. And of course, on top of that, he added a religious layer, and then he thinks that he's a chosen one, or kind of like a messianic or a divine mandate to rule. And you need this Ethiopia's great tradition to make sense of your own power claim somehow. So it's all this kind of like making it so difficult for us to have a sense of direction and to have a sober and honest reflection over our contentious issues. Federalism, or how to organize our politics or the political structure, is something which can only be negotiated but not imposed. I don't see that coming, and I'm afraid it might be more conflictual and violent unless we go through this process. And Abiy being Abiy, he might surprise us with everything is possible. And for me, he's a phenomenon. He happened in 2018. Ever since, a day has become too long in Ethiopian politics. Our news has been breaking for the last 3 years, and it will do so also after that. Or maybe when he feels that he consolidated power, he might be a bit more relaxed, and we might really see some sort of this kind of negotiation or a negotiated settlement that I'm really yearning for. But at the moment, very polarized. It's kind of, there are different ends of that pendulum. Everybody wants to pull it in its direction. And I just can't, believe my ears when I hear there are political forces say like, why Abiy has not yet scrapped the constitution? What is he waiting for? I mean, this cannot be political naivety. It goes even further than that. Or some were saying, how come that, he's so daring to think of constitutional amendment? This is something, again, so he's really pushed and pulled in several directions, and himself being deliberately ambiguous is complicating things. So it's kind of like we are left with these layers and layers of complexities and problems, and we never had that kind of the necessary debate, public debate at the national level.
Thank you, Dr. Dereje. So negotiations, building trust. Professor Smidt, what's your vision for Ethiopia in the future? How can Ethiopian unity take place? What needs to be done in the future?
Yes, for reasons of time, let me try to be very short now, because we also need the question and answer session. But we have to start always with the question, what is federalism? What we are talking about? We very often believe that this model or that model will be good for Ethiopia, which is, again, I have said it in a different way before, part of the political disease which has befallen Ethiopian elites, that we always look for models which will work on the ground, and we do not look enough into processes. Models are a static element in political discussion. Processes are by default open-ended, and that's part of this belongs this. I want to say this because this contributes also to the points mentioned by Dr. Dereje. We are too much focusing on winning a specific debate, or winning over people to side with us. So it's very often also to some degree Machiavellian. How can we establish our power structures, our elites, and so, and then using a model which will finally be perceived as a solution for everything. And federalism, if we understand it well, is not one model once applied and then working. Federalism, if we understand it well, is a description of a process. Federalism means the recognition that diversity does exist, different kinds of diversity, not only ethnic, ecological, economical, and so on. Diversity by itself, by default, is also a resource, because it gives people a possibility to find their own place in their community, within their region. So federalism is a process of responding to diversities. And to come to the point, we do not, we cannot say what is the final outcome, but we have to do everything to work on processes of participation, which of course always start from existing structures. They don't start from removing structures first, which is also part of a rather modern political disease of always removing everything first, starting from the scratch, as if scratch exists. It does not exist. We do not start with new people. We don't remove their minds and start everything anew. This is not real. This is not reality. So we start always from existing structures. And then as a next step, we look into structures of participation. And yes, this is really a problem since years, but especially during the recent developments of the last months, we have seen that due to internal problems of power competition and contradictions, the central state tendency of intervention has increased steadily. It was already visible before, but it has increased steadily, which decreases structures of participation, also structures which allow people to identify with the state. So the identification of the people with the state is at stake. And here we are in the danger. This is decreasing now. And to come to the conclusion, every work on solutions for Ethiopia can only focus on existing structures of participation, from traditional to very modern, within an existing framework, and then improve them. So we are in the beginning, if we are lucky, of a very long process of solutions, again in plural, which are even different from region to region. I mentioned pastoralists, different land traditions, which are very different from region to region and make different kinds of participation very necessary. And so we cannot say the Swiss model, the European Union model, or so will work. No, we need to define a dynamic process which is focusing on participation within existing political structures. Thank you.
Thank you. So more processes of participation instead of models. Thank you for this discussion. I would now like to invite you to engage in the Q&A and ask you questions either directly by raising your hand or just put it in your question in the chat. And now I hand over to Dr. Maya Pries. Thank you.
Okay, I think some of the questions have already been answered, so you can all read all of them. As it was said, now that aims is one thing, but the process is more necessary. And so to the question, for example, that the big idea Ethiopians should be enchanted now for a peace and unity, isn't it? And stop violence. Yes, as it was already said that, yes, but the process to reach those aims, that is the problem. But I would take here another question. Is there a difference between women and men's perceptions of Ethiopia's future? Who would like to answer this one?
As usual, I'm happy if Dr. Dereje starts.
Now you first.
Okay, I can. Yes. Thank you for the question regarding women. And let me add also other groups within the society. We were now talking a lot about regions and ethnic groups and social political structures on the ground. Evidently, we do deal with also gender questions. We have to be very clear about traditions of exclusion of large groups of the society. This can be specific local ethnic subgroups, which are excluded from political processes locally because of a very well established elite structure. Very often these elite structures are male structures. And there was one question which has asked, what is the role of women, or are there studies on the role of women in these in federalism, in social political structures on the ground? As to my knowledge, what we have is first studies on the role of women in traditional societies, including their own agency, which is sometimes underestimated, but no good structures of what it means for the modern building up of Ethiopia. But to come to the point, participation and including self-determination certainly does not only include one block which we would perceive as an ethnic group, which is by itself not unified, but by itself diverse. We look at the clans, we look at different political and economic elites and groups, and we look at the gender difference. So what is extremely important is also discussions, which are again different from region to region by default. What is the role of women in this political structure? Will we have a man who will lead, let me make it simple, who will lead the Women's Association, because he is the one who has the legal knowledge how to registrate it. The women will all meet in the Women's Association with the man talking and teaching them how to interact with the state. Is this the solution? We have seen such tendencies. So self-determination, participation certainly means first starting from a point, let's say from a recognition of weaknesses within this participatory process. And one of the weaknesses is an unfinished integration of women in the political process, including in traditional societies. But this also goes along with a diagnosis: where did women act strongly within traditional societies? We have a lot of examples, and then are silenced by a rather modern society where modern, well-educated men tell the traditionally strong women how to behave towards the modern state. There's a process of exclusion of traditionally rather strong, powerful women within local societies, but an exclusion in relation to the modern state. So we should not be illusioned by the fact that a lot of women have been appointed to central positions. If we look a little bit lower in the level, the reality looks quite different. So here, yes, it's an open question, but I wanted to underline how open the question is, how much has to be done there.
Thank you. Then Dr. Dereje.
Yes. Speaking about women's voice, I mean, although Wolbert rightly said maybe there is greater space for women's voice in traditional systems than so-called modern systems in the Ethiopian context, we should not forget that by and large, this is a very patriarchal society. I mean, it's kind of like it is a spectrum, and maybe pastoralist societies and other people in Ethiopia might be a bit more inclusive, but by and large, we are here dealing with a very kind of patriarchal society, and no wonder that our politics has been very masculine. It's very masculine politics, very exclusionary at that. That's why maybe this now the gender reform as part of political reform of Abiy administration makes sense, and we have to pay attention to that. Of course, we are not naive. We know political participation of women goes much further than, head count or having women in this or in that office, but at least symbolically, it's also very important. And maybe it's just too early for a critical appraisal, but something which I really would like to do research on or read or know about is, what difference have they really made, or can they make? To what extent political representation could be translated into meaningful impact in changing the lives of women, or a greater voice for women. When I read that with some of my own women colleagues, and they would say, like, why do you expect them to fix things overnight? I'm not expecting them to fix it overnight, but like, have they really articulated that idea? So, no, they are not there because they are women, because they are intellectual or have capacity. But I would have had my own kind of, if I were a woman and become president of Ethiopia, I would be president plus, and I'd like to bring that plusness with me, and then see what is it that which I can do, or test the limits. There might be pushback, but just to say that we can't do because the structures are too thick, I think this is not it's not very persuading. And 50% of Ethiopia's cabinet now are women. Like, just take the Minister of Transport, for instance. What has she really done to mainstream gender in the thing that she's doing? I'm not talking about these big ideas of changing the lives of women here and there. In that specific sector, even to take a sectoral approach, and then really, test the limits. Like, this needs to be done differently to make a difference. Are they doing that? I don't know. Maybe it's just too early, as I said. But this is something which I would like to know a bit more further. It has the potential for change in speaking about women's voice, and whether it's kind of that, like anybody else, they are also co-opted, and then they have their own priorities. That remains to be seen. But something interesting has happened in Ethiopia, even at least at a symbolic level. It's good to see that our president is woman, 50% of cabinet are women. Is it not interesting now? It's, there is a potential for feminizing Ethiopian politics or softening our masculine politics. But then, I would expect to come from National Election Board to do things a bit differently. I would like to see a bit more gender angle to our electoral process. Or Maaza, heading the Supreme Court. What is she doing to do it differently? I mean, it's kind of like, this is something which I'm very much excited, but I would like to see a bit of a result. And I know that I might get a bit of bashing, like, I'm demanding too much and leaving women issues for women kind of stuff. But I mean, why not? Because there could have greater sensibility. And then, as I tell my students, when you are given a milk, make sure that you make yogurt, cheese, and butter, and get out of it, kind of it. And the reason why they might be there, why they are appointed by Abiy, might be entirely different reason. It might be kind of, co-opting celebrities or appropriating the woman. Anything is possible, but now that they are there, but at least, testing the limits and doing it differently. Have we seen that? I'm not so sure. Maybe somebody has to pick it up as a research topic. What does it mean? When does political representation leads into impactful change?
Dr. Dereje, here is Wolfgang Heinrich, who is asking, how will pushing through elections affect the chances of an honest debate?
Oh, yeah, we know that by its very nature, election is polarizing. Even in mature democracies, it's in the nature of the game. Yeah, you demonize your opponent, and you kind of like you make it appear, kind of trash somehow, and all exaggerations are there. It's part of the game. In our case, I wish we had that conversation way before. Again, I mean, we are presented with so many missed opportunities somehow. And that's, most of us, many Ethiopians had faith in Abiy and gave him the benefit of the doubt. One thing that I really criticizing from that, it's not really to think that, to take himself a bit more seriously than he should have. He had this kind of like, he said, I am the transition. I am the one who it's not even a party now. The entire the well-being or the survival of the nation was made to hang on an individual, which is a high-level risk somehow. This is because of his own self-understanding as a messiah somehow. I was talking to Sophie earlier. Yeah. He's practicing evangelical. He takes. I mean, it's no wonder that he's fighting with TPLF, because from a very relatively ungodly political animal to incredibly godly one, kind of. So it's no kein Wunder, as Germans say. It's no wonder that these two are in trouble. And I mean, he is really invoking God in repeated religious references, and his conception of politics and his idea of prosperity and his idea of even transition is very much informed by his religious ideology. So in that sense, we really squandered the time. The last 2.5 or almost 3 years by now should have been time, to have that kind of decent, honest reflections and conversations, somehow politics of concern, so that we'll have more statesmen, not just simply politicians, because politicians make short-term calculations. They want to win narratives, or they want to win debates, but the issue goes further than that. But unfortunately, we missed that space, and somehow, the entire nation was on ecstasy somehow. I don't know. Now I would retrospectively say, how come that we thought that, Abiy would fix our problems? He made us believe, we wanted to believe, and then we missed that important opportunity. We should have had a government of national unity, I would rather say, and, this kind of conversation. But now, we are into election in a war context. You can imagine what kind of conversation. It could only be, maybe after that election, national dialogue processes should start. And that has to be organized in a way that it is participatory and inclusive, not something which is given out of Abiy's grace, but the situation demands it.
Thank you, Professor Smidt. Here's one question in the chat that I think is very relevant for you. We discussed this previously as well. What is the role of communication systems and media and languages in social organization? Are there theoretical models? Coming back to the reality in Ethiopia, understanding the need to move from a contest state to a voluntary state. Where could be the starting point?
Yeah, thank you. Let me add one phrase on the elections, but it's directly related to this question. We can put it together. Elections, especially in the context of Western discussions, are very often understood as sort of the realization of the participatory processes. So participation of the population in the state is assured, among others, of course, through elections. This contains a misunderstanding. If elections within a de facto autocratically acting state are the only element of participation, it means in a very loaded, politically loaded context of discussions which exclude each other, then it is the contrary of participation. It is stopping participation, and that's exactly what we observe these days. There's a lot of exclusion going on, processes of exclusion, including even processes of self-exclusion as a response to exclusion. I hope it's not too abstract, but we can simply and shortly say the elections are, for the moment, a symptom of failed communications, of failed participation processes. However, if we say elections should not take place, what should be put at place, and it's quite evident that this alternative is much more terrifying, because it would mean a more focus on even informal leading structures, like Dr. Dereje has just described, more focus on one man and his supposed genius to respond to all the needs of local or elite concerns or similar. So of course the elections are part of a necessary process, but they are by far not a solution. They are part of the problem for the moment, We have to focus on any kind of structures of participation. And here we come directly to the need of looking into which communication structures exist. How are communication structures established to increase dichotomies, binary dichotomic ways of thinking, suppressive, oppressive structures? To which degree do the existing communication structures even contribute to this? Where are communication, let's say, habits, structures, whatever word we want to use, which may be used to come to a better participation of the very different regions and zones and subgroups which do exist. It was mentioned before, within the Oromo, which are not a unitarian group, they are very different groups, very different realities, including subgroups who are certainly not well represented. So this comes directly to the question of language and media. And of course, one of the solutions is always a strengthening of local languages, because if people start from their local languages, they will be able to start from the reference systems with which they grew up. On the other hand, multilingualism is a reality in many traditional societies. So this kind of local language approach very often leads to misunderstandings among especially modern elites who do not well how these traditional societies did function. In fact, multilingualism is a reality which we observe in a lot of complex societies, and that's precisely the answer also in the modern context. Of course, multilingualism, starting from schools and from teaching and starting from the families, has to be in the center also of communication. And it does not mean that when you speak Oromifa, you would say one thing to please the Oromo, and when you start speaking Amharic, you would take in the discourses which are popular among the elites or among the groups with whom you're talking. That's not multilingualism. That's a very interesting form of Machiavellism, and just increasing problems. So this again is directly related to the question of language use. So yes, we need a lot of translation systems, knowing more about each other, because for the moment, what we have are communication structures which exclude each other. I communicate with you because you're part of my group and we understand each other, and we will just not communicate with the others. And if we communicate with the others, we will hide our identity maybe, or we will confront them directly. So this is the kind of communication structures which have been raising during, I would say, well over 100 years. Because of an expanding state which became stronger and stronger and imposing specific forms of political co-optation and identification with elites, which went through accepting some dominant languages, which had an effect of exclusion. But we see these processes of exclusion also in local levels. If you speak one language, you have again to co-opt to the dominant vision of your group. So communication, if we want it to be more successful, for sure, includes multilingualism. It includes a strengthening of local languages, including in education, including in political communication, but it would include a lot of translation structures. So the European Union, in a way, shows us one example of what can be, in which direction we may be able to go, but it needs a lot of engagement on the ground in building up and already existing old structures and modernizing them. Multilingualism, as I say, I repeat it, is one of the secrets of success in participatory structures. Even Switzerland, to some degree, is an example for that. In a number of other states, multilingualism is not fractioning societies. In the contrary, it is a means to bring them together into processes of political exchange and even reconciliation.
We have somebody raising his hand. Haptom Kazevidi.
Sorry, I guess Wolbert answered my question partly, but when I meant language, basically in a very complex society, like diverse society like Ethiopia, if we were to begin, or like if we take also hypothetical society, how do we separate? How do we begin the organization? Separation is part of federation or part of dividing so that we have self-administrative entities or components or clusters. Where does it begin? Do we have a language or communication systems as a basic criteria, or do we take other criteria? What are the theoretical models there? We can take out Ethiopia's context out of this, but I want to understand if there are some ideas there somehow. Thank you.
I think this is perfect for Dr. Dereje.
You have to unmute yourself, please.
This goes back to what Wolbert was saying, kind of like, starting with models, or this model shopping might not really help, but rather could potentially complicate the situation, but rather more kind of a grounded approach or bottom-up approach, and reflecting what the reality on the ground is, and then maybe, of course, to look for frames or models maybe afterwards. But the very term model itself makes it kind of like more tight and then kind of rigid, that we have to bend in and then fit into that model. So we need to have a different habit of thinking somehow, and kind of towards a more grounded approach, which reflects local realities or complexities. Someone also mentioned, for instance, given the diversity, it makes sense to have a smaller units of government, and still Ethiopia is more than 80 ethnic groups or linguistic communities or cultural communities, which not all of them are kind of recognized. And the more kind of sound approach would be kind of at the zonal level, or kind of sub-regional level units of governance might be the way forward. Yes, I also think that even go further, rather than zones, Weredas might even be more meaningful, more manageable units. This is where people are anyway. And even if you take the governance structure under EPRDF, it's a three-tiered federal system. So you have a federal government, the region, even in some cases, even four. Federal, regional, zonal, and Wareda or district level. So much emphasis was given at the regional level that zonal and Waredas came at a very, very late stage, and even then it wasn't really done properly. This issue of inclusion of minorities, it makes sense really to create that space for them to participate at a very, very local level, where they can make a significant contribution, but their rights could also be recognized. Also, maybe you set up a mechanism or introduce new political incentives for dominant groups to work with minorities, because then you shift the competition among the so-called dominant groups, but who will win? Is the one who really engage and mobilize the minorities. So it is possible to have this kind of institutional mechanism which fosters this sort of inclusivity. I remember, for instance, back in the early 2000s, when I was doing research in Gambela, the category they are playing in the peripheries is not so much ethnic. Sometimes it is, but it's kind of this highland, lowland is very salient political category. And, there are around 25% of Gambela's population, even more, Benishangul's population are called highlanders or Dagenya. And they have kind of like, politically disenfranchised or limited, or they're called non-titular groups in the new regional states. And regional constitutions have kind of make it openly clear political ownership of Gambela goes for 5 groups of people, Benishangul for 5 groups of people, regardless of the settlement pattern or its social composition. So the highlanders felt really excluded and they felt very insecure. But at some point, there was intense competition. There was a modicum of political pluralism in Gambela. And then there was the opposition party and the regional ruling party. Both are from indigenous people. The competition was so intense that both of them looked toward the highlanders in order to enhance their political standing. So in their campaigns, they say that we are the most Highlander-friendly political party. We want to include our brothers, the Highlanders. This is really interesting. Sometimes, democratic institutions or platforms could also bring in their own a certain degree of participation somehow. It's inherent in it if you allow that to run its natural course. And this is the first time that the Highlanders felt really empowered, that their vote really matters. And then, but that was a very brief moment. That's why in areas where they were the majority, came 2005, what happened? 100% of the Highlanders voted for CUD, not for EPRDF, because they wanted, it's kind of like they wanted to settle this political score, like they don't feel secure, they don't feel safe with indigenous political parties, whoever come from Addis or elsewhere. That's where their political salvation lies, kind of it. So it's also not just simply having a lower level of government, but kind of like the kind of political incentive that we introduce into political structures to make the process inclusive. And it is possible. Then maybe sometimes some kind of well-tried institutional arrangements can also be consulted without bending ourselves too much into these models or structures or mechanisms, but in a more pragmatic way, go for what works, not just simply because it is said it is kind of a standard way or it's pushed by a certain donor, but like first start with the ground. What is it? What kind of exclusion are we dealing with? How can we mediate different competing and at times conflicting interests somehow? Yeah, cultural rights, and then this created a certain ethnic homeland-like things, but how about citizenship rights? How can we mediate between different types of rights so that they don't have to be so conflictual? And then with this kind of sincerity, you can really introduce more integrative or inclusive structures or mechanisms. So at the Warada level, it's possible to broaden the degree of political participation through different incentive mechanisms.
One more question in the chat before we finish soon. Also, there is a question by Dr. Beran, who's asking, we have over 80 ethnic groups with similar number of languages. However, we have only 11 regions, not 80. So the ethnic federalism didn't also address its cause. Some people are suggesting having zones, much smaller sizes and more likely to represent many, but having much more similar values to be as an alternative base of regionalization. What is your opinion on that?
I think this is what I just tried to react to somehow. So maybe Wolbert might add if he has more to say on this.
Yeah, I feel precisely what was said now is partially an answer to this question. Let me add just one term to it because it will also help us to be more clear about the structures which we are discussing now, the political structures. It's the term subsidiarity. What we have observed, yes, there was a sort of establishment of a, let's say, first attempted structure of federation, but it's an attempted structure with a lot of unclarities, increase of polarizations, and an unclear structures of participation, including the treatment of minorities within these groups. Sometimes they were well integrated. Dr. Dereje has just mentioned a specific observation. In some cases, exclusion even increased, which we have in a number of territories. So yes, what we have observed is a sort of first step towards a federation, which is always a basic structure for assuring participation of the diverse groups of a country. But yes, true, the Killiluch, they don't represent all 80 groups, 80 plus groups of Ethiopia. Of course they don't. So what we need is subsidiarity in the sense that what can be decided on local levels should be discussed there, should be decided there in cooperation with higher structures. Here we see a real weakness in the Ethiopian state because while we had a decentralization of the entire state of Ethiopia, at least in theory, in some cases in practice, we did find also phenomena of centralization in a number of regions where political elites who were representing the Killil were dominating political discourses and decision-making. A very simple example, even from Mekelle itself. Mekelle is a growing city until the war. Now it's in a very difficult situation. The growing means, like in the case of the master plan of Addis Ababa, that surrounding lands belonging to peasants, which belong by default to other kinds of interest groups, decision-making structures, even traditional ones, informal ones, that these lands were step by step to be included into urban setting and the urban growth. So what happened? People in the center went to the peasants and told them what is good for them. So people in the center of Mekelle went to people in the outskirts of Mekelle. Imagine that. It's a very small territory within which this happens, telling them what will happen, what has been decided, leading to peasants' protests. By the way, that was not in the news, but it was precisely on a small scale what was going on in the case of the Addis Ababa master plan. Really small scale, but the pattern was exactly the same. What does it tell us? Lack of participatory structures, lack of subsidiarity, lack of even the awareness of the need of the inclusion of the different social structures, including economical groups of very different kinds into the decision-making processes. In short, participation is assured not through a majority decision, but through decisions integrating minorities of any kind. This is now a very general remark, but here we see quite precisely what was going on wrong on the ground.